Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to our supplementary lectures. And in this lecture, we want to cover divisions of weak hadiths based on a violation of condition 3, which is a complete chain of narration, a complete isnad. Now, remember, the main reasons that hadith scholars would have to consider a hadith weak is either an issue with the reliability of the narrators in the chain. They don't fulfill condition 1, being adl, or condition 2, being a dhabit, or the chain itself is incomplete, and that's condition 3, having a complete isnad. And so we now want to talk about the different types of weak hadiths based on an incomplete chain of narration, even if all of the available narrators are in and of themselves thiqat, or people of confidence. And again, I'll keep repeating these terms, adl, dhabit, thiqat, isnad, just so that we can digest them and become familiar with them. So we will use a hypothetical chain of transmission that you see at the top of the slide from A through G, where, remember, the beginning of the chain, A, is actually the scholar who finally records the hadith, like, for example, Imam al-Bukhari. The end of the chain, G, is the end closest to the Prophet, and that would be one of the companions, one of the Sahaba, who hears the hadith directly from the Prophet, peace be upon him, and then he transmits it to the next generation, one of the successors or tabi'un, and that would be narrator F, who then transmits it down the line to E, and so forth, all the way until it gets to A a couple of centuries later, who would be someone like Imam al-Bukhari, who would record the hadith. So now, what are the different types of hadith based on incomplete chains of transmission? The first and most important is known as a hadith mursal, and this is a hadith which is sent forth or hurried. And its definition is that the companion, narrator G, is missing. We have a successor who lived in the generation after the Prophet and never directly met him, and he narrates directly from the Prophet. So you notice that in the hadith mursal, we have a chain that goes Prophet to F, missing companion G, and then down to A. This is known as a hadith mursal, sent forth or hurried. Another type is what is known as a hadith mu'allaq, a hanging hadith. And in this form of hadith, one or more narrators sequentially from the beginning of the chain, which is the end closest to the hadith collector A, is missing. So, for example, you notice that narrator B is missing, and A narrates directly from C, who is someone that he has never met, but he says that according to C, according to D, according to E, according to F, according to companion G, the Prophet said such and such. So narrator B is missing. This is known as a hadith mu'allaq. So in this case, the hadith collector is not narrating directly from his sheikh or teacher, but from his teacher's teacher or beyond. Now, I want to call to your attention that the most extreme form of the mu'allaq hadith is where the entire chain is missing. And narrator A just simply says, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said. And then he relays the hadith, omitting the chain. So, as you will notice, that is what we all typically now do in our modern day discourse when quoting a hadith. So, when we simply stand up in a khutbah or a talk and say, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, that is, in some sense, a hadith mu'allaq. Now, we do that because we believe that there's a complete chain, but we're just simply not quoting it, but I just wanted to call your attention to that. There was a time when this would not have been acceptable, and if someone quoted the Prophet, he would have been met with a statement like, name us your men. In other words, provide us your chain of transmission before we're willing to listen to you. The third type is known as a hadith mu'dal. Mu'dal means it is saddled with difficulty. And in this form of the hadith, two narrators sequentially are missing from the chain, but not from the beginning of the chain. So that it's not mu'allaq. It's not that B and C are missing. And so in this case, you notice that narrators D and E are missing. And so this is known as a hadith mu'dal. Finally, we get to hadith munqata', which is a severed hadith. And this is a general term applying to any incompleteness in the chain. So it would cover all of the types we've already discussed, as well as any other variant not covered by them. But in the opinion of some hadith scholars, it is any incompleteness in the chain that is not covered by the other types. So the hadith could be mursal, could be mu'allaq, could be mu'dal, or if it has some other type of defect, like for example, narrators D and F are missing, then that would be called a hadith munqata'. We prefer using it as a general term to suggest any incompleteness in the chain, and so the first three would be specific and the last would be general, but both definitions do exist. So why did we go through all of these arcane terms? Well, for two reasons. One is to be familiar with the terminology that you would encounter if you read seriously in the science of hadith. The other and more important reason is to talk specifically about the first category, the hadith mursal. Remember, the hadith mursal is where the companion is missing and a successor narrates directly from the Prophet. Now, technically, any incomplete chain is considered enough to make the hadith weak because a critical condition, condition 3, a complete isnad, to have it be sahih has been violated. However, it's important to know that there has been very significant discussion and disagreement among the leading hadith scholars about the status of mursal hadiths. These have ranged from the opinions of the great scholar Ibn Hazm, who rejects them outright as weak, to the opinion of other great scholars like Imam Malik, who thinks that the mursal hadith of a trustworthy successor is essentially as good as a hadith with a full isnad, on the assumption that since a companion was dropped from the chain, and since all companions, in the opinion of most Sunni jurists, are thiqat by definition and equally trustworthy, it doesn't matter which companion was dropped from the chain. You remember we talked a little bit about this issue in the first supplementary lecture. Now, for those who hold this opinion, of course, they also then implicitly believe that no successor would simply forge a hadith. And so when they drop a companion, then that's okay because they couldn't have forged the hadith. They heard it from some companion and it doesn't really matter which because all of the companions are equally trustworthy. In our opinion, given the large volume of forged hadith and given that we know that hadith forgery began either in the lifetime of the Prophet or very shortly thereafter, we think that this assumption is highly questionable, but God knows best. Now, there are multiple other approaches between these two extremes, which set some conditions on accepting the mursal hadiths. Among these conditions is that it is supported by another hadith with a complete isnad, even if that other hadith is weak. So it may be weak because the narrators are weak, but the isnad is complete. Alternatively, some find it acceptable if it's not contradicted by a musnad hadith, by a hadith that has a full isnad, and if it is the only hadith available on the issue. Another criterion that some scholars applied is that the successor narrating the mursal hadith is a senior or older successor. An example of that is a successor named Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab. And here, some scholars would accept a mursal hadith from a senior successor, but not from a junior successor. The rationale here is that if it's narrated by a junior successor, there may actually be two dropped links from the chain, one of them being the senior successor, one being a companion, and so they wouldn't accept the hadith from the junior successor, but they would accept it from the senior successor based on the rationale that we've already covered. On the whole, I think it's fair to say that many or most scholars seem to lean toward considering mursal hadiths weak or accepting them only with conditions. However, major scholars like Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa accept the mursal hadiths, at least in some instances, and use them as evidence or proof in religious rulings. And Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal seems to accept at least some of them, along with other categories of weak hadiths, if there are no other hadiths on an issue. He preferred these hadiths to opinion, ra'y, or deductive reasoning about a religious matter, and we'll talk a great deal more about this, inshallah, in the second module. But it should be clarified here that when someone says Imam ibn Hanbal, who of course would not accept or use fabricated or rejected hadiths, but would accept weak hadiths, it's important to note that he classified hadiths into only sahih and da'if. He did not use the category of hasan, and so many of the hadiths he considered da'if would probably be classified by others as hasan hadiths, and those are the ones that he would accept. So this gives us then a look at categorizations of hadiths in terms of weakness based on violation of condition 3, that they do not have a complete chain of transmission. That condition is then further subclassified into the different types of hadiths that we have covered. And again, just as a quiz, try to recite what are those hadiths. They are the hadith mursal, then the hadith mu'allaq, then the hadith mu'dal, and the hadith munqati. Okay, assalamu alaikum, until the next lecture, inshallah.